Welcome back to our continuing exploration of Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work, The Divine Guide in Early Shi'ism. Today, we're going to explore the sources of this early doctrine, the books and scholars that transmitted these teachings. We'll meet the compilers who gathered these traditions in the 9th and 10th centuries. I will understand also the fierce intellectual battle that nearly destroyed this knowledge. And we'll see how later scholars performed a delicate balancing act to preserve these texts while maintaining their credibility. If you've been following our series, you know we've been uncovering layers of meaning that have sometimes been obscured by centuries of theological debate. Today's episode is particularly important because Amir-Moezzi is essentially giving us the roadmap, showing us exactly which texts preserve the original esoteric understanding of the Imamate before it was filtered through later rationalist interpretations. The quest for authenticity. Let me start with a fundamental question. How do we know what the early Shia actually believed about their Imams? This isn't just an academic exercise, it's about recovering a spiritual heritage that Amir-Moezzi argues has been partially hidden or downplayed over the centuries. And Amir-Moezzi is attempting something quite revolutionary in Islamic studies. He's trying to recover what he calls the esoteric non-rational Imamism. And he makes a crucial distinction here between what he calls esoteric non-rational Imamism, that's the original mystically oriented understanding of the Imamate, and the later rationalist interpretations that became dominant after the 5th Islamic century. He points to Ibn Babawayh, also known as Sheikh Saduq, as representing the last basically faithful representation of this early doctrine in his dogmatic works. Now, why does this distinction matter so much? Well, imagine if the most profound spiritual teachings of a tradition were suppressed or gradually reinterpreted to fit more philosophical and rationalist frameworks. That's essentially what has happened in Imami Shi'ism, according to Amir Moezzi's research. The nature of early sources. The earliest Imamite writings weren't grand theological treatises. They were small collections of hadith, traditions, and sayings gathered directly by the followers of the Imams themselves. And although these collections primarily focused on jurisprudence, on practical religious law, they also contain profound mystical or esoteric teachings about the nature of the Imamate. What's fascinating, and this really supports Amir-Moezzi's thesis, is that many of these early collections were later incorporated into the larger compilations. So we have these nuggets of original teaching preserved within later works, like archaeological layers just waiting to be excavated. The great turning point. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Around the middle of the 5th Islamic century, we had this pivotal moment in Imami intellectual history. Two major scholars, al-Mufid and his student Sharif al-Murtada, launched what Amir-Moezzi describes as attacks against the non-rational aspects of traditionalist Imamism. Now, let me be clear about what this means. They, they weren't heretics or outsiders. They were major Shia scholars who felt that certain traditions about the Imam's supernatural knowledge, their cosmic role, their miraculous powers, that these traditions needed to be either reinterpreted or set aside in favor of the more rationally defensible positions. In the new methods that they had learned on Hadith classification, they also accused these traditions to lack authority because they were khabar al-wahid as opposed to mutawatir. This classification terminology is about the number of chains of transmission for a given hadith. So khabar al-wahid are those hadith which, although they have multiple chains of transmission, but not sufficient in number as to classify them as mutawatir, which have a very large number of independent chains. However, Shaykh Tusi, who came later, took a more accommodating approach to these traditions, and he struck a certain kind of balance between rationalism and traditionalism. While respecting the rationalist approaches, he recognized the importance and authority of these Khabar al-Wahid reports. And he essentially rehabilitated them, meaning that he re-established the validity of these reports in the earlier compilations. Thanks to al-Tusi, the early compilation survived. Scribes continued to copy them, the later scholars continued to respect them, and libraries continued to preserve them. However, and this is crucial for understanding the current state of Shia scholarship, even though Shaykh Tusi saved these texts from being completely marginalized, the rationalist current had become predominant. So predominant that the result, as Amir-Moezzi observes, was an almost absolute silence descended over those traditions that posed problems for rationalist theology. The texts were still copied, the authors were still respected, but the mystical esoteric dimensions were largely ignored, disregarded. Only the juridical sections, that is, the parts about religious law that didn't conflict with rationalist convictions, continued to be actively studied and commented upon. The primary sources, guardians of esoteric knowledge. Now let's meet the great traditionists whose compilations preserve the early esoteric doctrine. These compilations, these are the sources Amir-Moezzi identifies as absolutely essential for understanding authentic Imami doctrine. First, we have Saffar al-Qummi, who passed away in 290 Hijri, before the major occultation. And he is someone who actually lived during the time of the 10th and 11th Imams also. He was probably a direct disciple of the 11th Imam, Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam, and may have even known the hidden 12th Imam before the beginning of the greater occultation. His masterwork, Saffar al-Qummi's masterwork, although it has an incredibly long title, but in short, it's just usually called Basa'ir al-darajat, insights into the degrees, or stages of spiritual vision. Amir-Moezzi describes this as the first systematic compilation of traditions about Imamite doctrine, and it forms the basis of early Twelver metaphysics and mystical theology. Think about that. We have a direct link here to the Imams themselves through this compiler. Next, the famous Shaykh Kulayni, who passed away in 329 Hijri. His al-Kafi is one of the four canonical hadith collections in Twelver Shi'ism. But Amir-Moezzi specifically focuses on the usul, the section on foundational principles, and also the final volume called Kitab al-Rawda, the Book of the Garden, which contains more esoteric materials. Then we have Shaykh Nu'mani, who was actually Kulayni's scribe and student. He passed away around 360 Hijri, and his primary work, Kitab al-ghayba, the Book of Occultation, is the first great systematic compilation about the 12th Imam, his occultation, his eventual return, and also about early Imamite eschatology. This book is absolutely crucial for understanding the mystical dimensions of Shia messianism. Finally, among the primary sources, we have Ibn Babawayh Sheikh as-Suduq, who passed away in 381 Hijri. And here's something really interesting that Amir-Moezzi points out. Even though Sheikh Saduq is still presenting these esoteric themes, these mystical narrations, but he's doing so in a more, so to say, moderate fashion than his predecessors. So we can already see the beginning of the shift towards a more rationalist presentation. The number of books, which were mostly hadith compilations from Sheikh Saduq, is staggering. Various scholars attributed between 43 and 193 works to Sheikh Saduq, although most of them are now lost. Amir-Moezzi uses several of his major doctrinal works, including books on the reasons and causes behind religious laws, his works on divine unity, and his collections of hadith dictation sessions and monographs on individual imams. The secondary sources, layers of interpretation. Amir-Moezzi then categorizes several types of secondary sources, and this categorization itself reveals so much about the evolution of Shia thought. First, there are works where the esoteric aspects aren't immediately evident, perhaps as Amir-Moezzi suggests, intentionally so. This includes writings attributed to the Imams themselves, like the beautiful Sahifa Sajjadiyah of the fourth Imam, or the tafsir commentaries attributed to Imam Jafar as-Sadiq and Imam Hassan al-Askari, peace be upon them, whose authenticity wasn't questioned at that time, and these texts certainly reflect early Shia spirituality. Second, we have sources only partially attached to esoteric non-rational Imamism. These include some early Quranic commentaries and collections about pilgrimage to holy sites. The authors of these works seem to represent what might be called an intermediary school. They accepted Khabar al-Wahid reports, but also employed some amount of dialectical reasoning, trying to perhaps bridge the gap between pure traditionalism and rationalism. Finally, there are sources whose authenticity or integrity haven't been fully established, like the famous Nahj al-Balagha, the collection of Imam Ali's sermons compiled by Sharif al-Radi, who interestingly was the brother of Sharif al-Murtada, one of the rationalist critics that we mentioned earlier. The methodological framework. What Amir-Moezzi is establishing here is absolutely crucial for any serious study of early Shi'ism. He's saying essentially, if we want to understand what the Imams actually taught about themselves, their cosmic role, their supernatural knowledge, and their spiritual authority, we need to focus primarily on these early compilations that preserved the esoteric traditions before they were filtered out through rationalist theology. This methodological choice is profound. It's not just about preferring older sources, it's about recognizing that a fundamental shift occurred in how the Imamate was understood and presented. The works of scholars like Allama Majlisi, centuries later, would attempt to revive interest in these esoteric dimensions, showing that this mystical current never completely disappeared, even if it was marginalized. Contemporary relevance. What makes Amir-Moezzi's approach so valuable is that it aligns with what other contemporary scholars of early Shi'ism have been discovering. Other famous scholars like Etan Kohlberg and others have shown that early Shi'ism was far more focused on the cosmic mystical role of the Imam than later theological presentations might suggest. This isn't about creating controversy or division, it's about recovering the full depth of the tradition. When we read these early sources with fresh eyes, we find description of the Imams as cosmic pillars, as bearers of divine light, as possessors of hidden knowledge. Ideas that might seem extravagant to modern rationalist sensibilities, but they were central to early Shia spirituality. Practical implications. For students and scholars of Shi'ism, this methodological framework provides clear guidance. When studying the concept of the Imamate, we can't simply rely on later systematic theological works that have been influenced by rationalist philosophy. We need to return to these sources, to Saffar's Basa'ir al-darajat, to the esoteric sections of Kulayni's al-Kafi, and to Nu'mani's descriptions of the hidden Imam. This also has implications for understanding contemporary Shia thought. The tension between rationalist and traditionalist approaches that Amir-Moezzi identifies in the 4th and 5th Islamic centuries continues in different forms today. Some scholars and communities emphasize the mystical, esoteric dimensions of the Imamate, while others prefer more rationalist, philosophical approaches. The question of authenticity. Now, one might ask, and this is a legitimate question, how can we be sure these early traditions are authentic? Amir-Moezzi addresses this by focusing on systematic compilations by known, respected scholars who had clear chains of transmission going back to the Imams themselves. Moreover, the very fact that these traditions were preserved despite later rationalist critiques suggests their deep roots in the community's collective memory. The persistence of these esoteric traditions across the different compilations and through the generations points to their authenticity and importance. Conclusion, the path forward. As we conclude today's episode, I want to emphasize just how revolutionary Amir-Moezzi's approach is. By identifying and prioritizing these specific early sources, he's providing us with a methodology to recover aspects of Shia spirituality that have been understudied for centuries. This isn't just about academic research, it's about understanding the profound spiritual vision of early Shi'ism. When we read about the Imams' knowledge of the unseen, their role as cosmic intermediaries, their possession of the sacred books and objects of all previous prophets, we're not just encountering folklore or exaggeration. We're touching the mystical heart of a tradition that sees the Imamate as the continuation and perfection of all prophetic missions. In future episodes, we'll begin exploring what these sources actually tell us about the nature of the Imam, their knowledge, their authority, their cosmic function. We'll see how the early tradition presents a vision of the Imamate that is both deeply mystical and profoundly relevant to the truth seeker, to the spiritual seeker. So thank you for joining me on this journey into the depths of early Shia thought. Remember, as we explore these teachings, we're not just studying history, we are uncovering timeless truths about spiritual authority, about divine guidance, and the hidden dimensions of existence. So until next time, may your search for knowledge be illuminated by the light of the Ahlul Bayt. Thank you. Ma salam.